Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I am Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Paes.
And today we are talking about the Enneagram and psychotherapy.
Right. Yeah, and because you are a psychotherapist, Bea, I am going to interview you if you're okay with this.
Of course. Yes, you can ask me anything you want about how I used the Enneagram in my psychotherapeutic practice for about 20 years.
Yes, and I want to mention that we decided to do this podcast because one person, Amanda Lindsay, commented on our Facebook group of Chestnut Paes Enneagram Academy that she would love to hear about this, and we thought it was a good idea. So thank you, Amanda. Amanda actually asked how you use it as a clinician. I know you're not very active anymore as a clinician because Chestnut Pies give you enough work and trouble already, but you have a lot of experience in that, as you said.
Yes. And I knew the Enneagram long before I became a clinician, a little bit like Amanda, who's also becoming a clinician. I knew it starting in 1990. And so I had been studying the Enneagram for a while before I even decided to go back to school to become a psychotherapist. So the Enneagram was in my mind for a long time, even before I started doing therapy with people.
Yeah, so my first question to you, and I think it's something that unavoidably you have already thought at least once or twice, and I think Amanda may have thought of the same herself, knowing the Enneagram, is how to do therapy without knowing the Enneagram, Bea.
Right. When I was in my internship and learning to be a therapist with other people learning to be therapists, I would often think to myself, I couldn't imagine how anyone would do therapy or be a therapist without the Enneagram. To me, it was just an invaluable tool. I thought of it as my secret weapon because I could so easily go to the heart of the matter so quickly when I was working with people. Sometimes when I was in group supervision, so as a young therapist, I would, for many years, be in groups, small groups of, 4 or 5 or 6 therapists working with a senior therapist. And we would study cases every week. And I'll never forget, we had with one supervisor in particular, every week he would ask, when someone would present a case, he would say, "So, what do you think is the core issue here? What do you think that is the thing you really need to work with this person?" After someone would talk about the case for 10 minutes or so, and I would always have a really coherent theory about what I thought was going on with the person and what I thought we should do as therapists to work with that person in the best possible way. And that's because I had the Enneagram. And often you can hear someone talking about a case or a person for a while, especially if they're, talking with them in therapy, and get a sense pretty clearly of what type they might be and have some ideas about which direction to go in to help them grow, because you understand their type and you understand what the types need to do when they're in therapy. So, and it was funny because people would give me funny looks like, "Wow, you already have a very clear idea about what the issue is and what you would do." But it was only because of the Enneagram. It wasn't because I was, any smarter than my colleagues. It was only because I had this special tool.
Very interesting, yeah. But actually, my more general first question is, tell us a little bit about your overall experience during 20 years as a psychotherapist using the Enneagram.
Okay, so being a therapist, especially in the beginning, it's challenging. It's a bit vulnerable because people come to you for help. People come to you to help them understand themselves. Now, one of the things I learned early on as a therapist is, although I'm still learning it today, I don't do psychotherapy in an ongoing way, but every once in a while I do some coaching and draw on some of my psychotherapeutic skills in a short-term way. But I learned early on that, and again, I'm a 2, so remember that as I tell you this. I learned early on that it's not up to you as a therapist to fix the person's problem. Uh, Often as a 2, I would work too hard. I would take on too much responsibility. Really, what you're there to do is help support and guide the person in solving their own problems, in addressing their own issues, in understanding themselves at a deeper level. And so when I would work with someone, where I would start always, and this is true to this day, is what is the person needing? And I think in that way, being a 2 is a good thing because 2s are often, we often have our antennas up for what do people need. And I do think there is a big stereotype of 2s that were always walking around looking for needs to fulfill, and I totally disagree with that. It's more about being liked and being seen in a positive light. But I definitely think that I would be listening for what is this person's story? What are they needing most? Where is the pain or the distress that they need to address and relieve? What do they need to know or learn about themselves to have a happier life or overcome a particular symptom or issue? Uh, and so I would be listening for that all the time. And often what I would hear is type-shaped issues, type-shaped problems. And the focus of attention would be really clear in what the person was focusing on as they were telling me about themselves in therapy. So I think for me, having known the Enneagram long before I became a therapist, it was just part of the way I thought. It's just part of the way I think even now. It's part of the way I interpret data coming in. It's really a pattern recognition method, and so I would be looking for patterns. I would be looking for ways to understand this person in the deepest way, in the most efficient way. And often, what I would start to hear in the story is an Enneagram story.
Yeah, I like that in a way you're saying how important it is for the therapist to work on their own biases, knowing the Enneagram and their own Enneagram types, and doing inner work so that they become better therapists before applying that with clients. I think that in between lines, I think you said that, right?
Yes, and I think that if anyone's listening to this who has either become a therapist or is in the process of becoming a therapist, I think it's one of the best benefits of becoming a therapist is it's an absolute requirement to learn to know yourself really well, mainly so you can get yourself out of the way of the person that you're working with, right? Because if we don't know ourselves enough, we can act out our own issues with the person, right? So if I didn't know I was a 2 or I didn't know what my inclinations were as a 2, I might unconsciously seek to get some of my needs met through the person I'm working with. And I think that's just a natural human thing, not something we should judge people for, but it's something you need to know. What am I likely to do that I do just by being me and having the type I have that could get in the way of this person? And so it was great for me because I learned about boundaries, right? As a 2, we're one of the types that aren't so good at boundaries. I didn't really know what they were. I didn't know how to maintain them or build them with people. But as a therapist, you need to learn to be very mindful of boundaries. both in terms of keeping everything that a person tells you confidential, but also how to have good boundaries with that person. And that can look like, starting and ending on time, not sharing too much about yourself when it's somebody else's therapy. Um, Different things like that were really important for me to learn. And also just how to notice my own feelings and my own patterns and my own beliefs so that I could identify them, name them as mine, and kind of just put them off to the side, so that I could see and hear the person I was working with more clearly. So I could really focus on understanding them and noticing if some bias of mine came in, even a perceptual bias came in, and recognize that so that I can keep my vision of this person in front of me clear. I can sort of scoot it out of the way. I can recognize, oh, that's my two thing. That's the way I tend to think about something. That's a belief I have. And the more that I can see that and take that out of the way, again, not judge myself for it, not take it out of myself completely, but just kind of bracket it off to the side, so that I can stay being a kind of open space for someone else to really be understood so that they can understand themselves better.
Mm. Now, at each country, the situation is different, both for the Enneagram and for therapy and psychotherapy. I want to mention this because we have listeners here for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast from all over the world, and also we teach in all continents together. And there are cases in which, in a certain country, there is no therapy or psychotherapy culture. There are not many professionals available, or there are some other cultural restrictions. And you also told me the other day how different it can be in the US, depending on the region you're in terms of people being receptive or not to therapy. Now, my question is overall, is it okay to mention the Enneagram to the client? And also, is it okay not to mention the Enneagram to the client?
So I think it's two questions, but I can see how they're related. So one question is, I think it's about culture and how if you live in different cultures, in some cultures, psychotherapy isn't seen in a positive light, or it's just not done. There aren't very many psychotherapists. It's not something that is seen as something that people do. And I think there are many reasons for this. And I think certainly there are certain countries where we've traveled and we've worked in where we've done Enneagram workshops. And sometimes when we work with people, we open up some new things in them that they want and need to explore more deeply. And we often will say this would be something good to explore with a therapist, because a therapist gives you that space and time to and support and witnessing to really understand something about yourself at a deeper level. And as we go through our lives, we often don't have that opportunity, and we don't realize we don't have that opportunity and that we need that opportunity. I sometimes say that, hopefully we're moving to a time when therapy and psychotherapy, especially, is more widely accepted. I think there's still a stigma in many cultures, including my own culture in the United States, that it's bad to need help, that you should be able to take care of yourself or do things by yourself or pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's a common cultural theme in my culture. Also, there's a big idea, I think, that if you go to psychotherapy, and I think that this is in a lot of cultures, there's something big that's wrong with you. right? That will be a sign to the people that hear that you're going to therapy that, "Ooh, you have a big problem that's bigger than everyone else's problems." And actually, often the opposite is true, is that you're wise enough to know that you need help, navigating your issues and problems. And we all, just part of being human is, suffering, is, having issues and challenges in our lives. And I think, and we sometimes say this, and I think it surprises people, that I think everybody could use psychotherapy. I mean, certainly some people need it more than others because they're suffering more or in more distress, or have a particular issue that affects them in a particularly deep way. However, it's, to me, it's a little bit like everybody has, a doctor that they go to if they need something physically, or if they get a checkup once a year. And it's a little bit like that. It's like you wouldn't walk around with a broken arm. And I think some people walk around with broken hearts, or with some sort of emotional or psychological issue that could easily be addressed in psychotherapy. But because there is this idea that that's not okay, or like you say, in some countries, it's just not part of the culture. It's not something that's available, for one reason or another. Then I think it makes it hard because people kind of have to either get along on their own, which again, therapy, it allows you to have a mirror. It allows you to have some open space, to have some objectivity, someone who isn't you, helping you ask the right questions, or just reflecting back what they're hearing from you, or adding some wise observations into what you tell them. I think therapy can be a really, really important aid to self-observation. And this is what we talk about all the time as the first and most primary method of the Enneagram, is self-observation. Is, can you observe or remember yourself all the time and notice what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you tend to do and not do. And this is, a way that we come to understand ourselves. And this self understanding is the biggest pathway to growth. Because what we encounter along the way of seeking to understand ourselves is often, wow, I've been sad about this thing for a long time, or I have a trauma that I've never healed or addressed because I thought I couldn't talk to anyone about it. I mean, so many of us have these things that we walk around with, and it becomes something where we're not allowing ourselves to live the fullest, most satisfying life that we could be living, because we just kind of take for granted that we'll always have to feel this way, or we have to carry around a burden or a load, or maybe we're carrying around something that belongs to our parents, or we're suffering from a relationship with a parent or a family member that keeps us in a difficult place in our family and our lives. And these are things that can affect us deeply. And so I think, in answer to the first part of the question, I think it's important to recognize when there are stigmas against getting help, against growing and understanding ourselves, that are just part of the culture that we've inherited, that isn't really supportive of our health and well-being and our deeper inner growth and development. So that's the first part.
Yeah, and just one thing to mention there. We are recording this podcast during the COVID pandemics, and we've been seeing how the online therapy system has really grown bigger, and we see people from different countries, having therapists in other countries, sometimes managing to overcome local limitations.
Yes, and there's a few things to be said about that. We are in the process of putting together a list of therapists that work with the Enneagram, that we know a bit and can recommend. Um, and because we've had a lot of requests, and I think this is a positive thing, for people who practice therapy, good therapists who know the Enneagram and work with the Enneagram, because as the Enneagram explodes in popularity, I think it helps people understand their need for support and going deeper into their own process. And so we're in the process of doing that. Also, as people may know, we offer a professional certification program for therapists and coaches and other kinds of practitioners. And one of the big reasons we're doing that is because we want to create a network or a community of like-minded therapists and coaches who can both support each other and help each other learn and learn the Enneagram at a deeper level and learn how to do what they do better in consultation with each other, but also so we can offer on our website a list of practitioners who are skilled and vetted, who have been through our program, who we can say know the Enneagram at a deep enough level. Because as we've talked about, I think in other podcasts, sometimes people know the Enneagram, the 9 types pretty well, but they may not know the subtypes, or they may not understand the instinctual level, or they may not have worked with the arrows, or they may have a limited view of how the so different parts of the Enneagram are really important to know when you're using it in something like psychotherapy, which is can be such a deep practice. And so one of the things we're wanting to do is once someone gets certified, they go on our website. So we won't be putting that on our website now because we're reserving that for people who have completed the program. However, because there's such a demand, such a need for people, we've got so many requests asking for recommendations. We are putting together that list, and um, we're hoping that that list can be something that helps people in different places all over the world.
Interesting. Yeah, you mentioned our professional workshops at CP, and we've been noticing that new practitioners come to these workshops because their clients are asking them if they know the Enneagram. And I think this is a very good sign of how much the Enneagram is growing and thriving. It's interesting to me to see that the Enneagram is driving more people to do more therapy. It feels great.
Yes, and I think some of the people who are asking us for recommendations for therapists, it just may not have occurred to them to go to a therapist until they really learned the Enneagram and learned all the big insights that has given them, and then it makes sense to go further with it and to work with someone who's skilled in supporting people using the Enneagram. And what I often say is, I think it just saves a lot of time. Sometimes what I would hear from people who were resistant to therapy was this idea or maybe a fear that, well, if I go to therapy, I'm going to be in therapy for years, and the therapist is going to want to make me dependent on them, whether it's because the therapist is meeting their own needs for their own livelihood, or that's just what happens in therapy, is that I get dependent on the therapist. And really, a good therapist is certainly not wanting to create any kind of dependency. Quite the opposite. It's like you learn to depend on your therapist for a period of time, so that, first of all, so that you learn to depend on someone, because for some people that's not easy, and that so you can eventually learn to do what the therapist does for you yourself. You can internalize what the therapist does to support you, and that's why therapists are so mindful about how they interact with their clients. For instance, when I was a therapist, I would notice very quickly if someone I was working with was very harsh on themselves, really critical, really judgmental of themselves. And you see that a lot with people in different levels, of course, but you see a lot of people who are quite self-critical but don't question that. They think it's not just ones. They think they should be critical on them of themselves because they've done things wrong, or they're not doing things right, or whatever it is. And what I would notice in myself is I would automatically start being really kind, and I would point out when they were being harsh or judgmental on themselves. And right there, that can be a really big thing, to have someone pointing out or even modeling a different way of being. And that's, of course, just one of many benefits to therapy, to working with someone, is having that relationship where you experience something hopefully more healthy. And that's of course why it's important to have a skilled, experienced therapist. And I think one of the benefits of having a therapist who knows the Enneagram is you can have a little more confidence that they've done their own inner work. Because when people would ask me for recommendations for therapists, one of the first things I always think about is, who is someone I know that's a therapist who's really aware of themselves, who's really doing their own work, who really knows themselves, who's, willing to be vulnerable, who has really been in their own therapy for many years. And again, I think it's a occupational duty for us therapists to do our own work, because to the extent that we don't, we will get in the other person's way.
Yeah. Shall we go back to that second part of the original question about mentioning or not the Enneagram to the
Yes.
client?
Yes, that's a really important question. Thank you. So when I was first working with the Enneagram, I started my first year as a student therapist was 1996. Um, and then for several years after that, the Enneagram wasn't as well known, and I didn't really mention it as much. So what I want to mainly say is, I think there are different ways you can use the Enneagram as a therapist, mentioning it or not. So in the beginning, I most of the time didn't mention it. Of course, I was also a new therapist, and so I was still learning the art of therapy, and bringing the Enneagram into that might have made it overly complicated both for me and the other person. So I was learning, for instance, to listen really deeply, to get myself out of the way, to understand the themes and needs that different people would bring, and what kinds of interventions to offer, what kinds of things to do to meet the person in the best possible way. And so, of course, if you're learning to be a therapist, you need to learn all that apart from the Enneagram. But very quickly, when I would start working with people in those first, maybe let's say 5 or 7 years, um, I usually would use it only in my head, partly because on the few occasions when I did mention it, and again, this was a different time, um, people either weren't really that interested, or at the beginning, I found it hard to explain it in an easy way that didn't take up too much time. And again, if you bring up something new with a client, you're using their time. So you need to be a little bit careful about how you manage that time and how much you spend on something that they may or may not want to use. So in the beginning, I would mostly use it in my own head. So I would recognize from what someone was saying or learning who they were over time, what type they likely were. Now, here's a really important thing. If you're not validating the person's type with them in an open, explicit way, it's really important not to be too sure of what their type is. So I would always hold it relatively lightly. I would say, wow, this person sounds like a 2, or this person seems like they could be a 6. But I'm not going to decide they absolutely are, because I can't be completely sure until I've really taught them the Enneagram, uh, told them what this type is all about, and had them validated from the inside. So we need to be very careful about that. However, in the beginning, when I couldn't really talk about it because it would take up too much time, and it was too, it was just not the right moment for me to be doing that. I would develop some hypotheses in my head, and I would always treat them as such, as good guesses, but not the absolute truth, because I couldn't be sure. And what I would do is I would offer some suggestions, some interventions based on what type they might be, and then see what happens. And to some extent, therapy can be a trial and error a little bit, especially when you're in the beginning, when you're still getting to know someone. So, you try something and you see how it goes. Does it seem to help the person, or does it not seem to help? Does it not really go anywhere? Um, I got taught at one point, if you offer something, if you say something and the person talks more and goes deeper, then that was a good thing. If you offer something and the person shuts down and doesn't say anything, or doesn't go deeper, then you probably didn't say the right thing. I would definitely use the Enneagram as a way of understanding the person, having some ideas about what to say, where to go, how to guide the person, and see what happened. Over time, what happened to me is that people started coming to me more knowing the Enneagram, and so they would come in and tell me what type they were, um, or they would be open to learning the Enneagram, and they would want me to help them find their type and teach them a little bit about the Enneagram as a way of entering into the therapy, as a tool that they wanted to use.
So I assume, B, that at times, in cases like this, you would include some Enneagram teaching in the therapy, even refer to some resources like books or websites, like using the Enneagram as modules as the person was doing therapy. But in other cases, you would use the Enneagram as you go, like depending on the moment. Is this true?
Yes, I'd say I was always using it in my head, as a way of making sense of what was happening, as a way of recognizing patterns and having ideas of what to do. But over time, I was able to use it more explicitly. Now, of course, I only work with people using the Enneagram because people come to me because of that, or um, you know, but that's just who I work with, given the fact that, I've written a couple books now, and I've been in this for a while. So now I always work with it explicitly. But there was a period of time when I was sort of doing both. Sometimes people would come knowing it, sometimes not. Now, there were a few times when I would when I tried to introduce it with someone, I just felt like, wow, that the Enneagram would really help them. However, as a therapist, you always have to be very careful about what you do, because you don't want to push something on someone. So there were a couple of times when I introduced the Enneagram to someone. And again, this was a different time. And so I think the Enneagram wasn't as well known as it is now. Um, and in some cases, the person really liked it, and yes, I would do a little bit of teaching. I would teach it. I had like a 10-minute talk I would do about what the Enneagram was and how it helps you. And sometimes, depending on the person, I might say a little bit about what type I thought they might be. But again, always saying it in terms of a guess and not a sure thing. And then I would refer them to some resources. I would give them a couple names of books. Sometimes I would give them a reference to a good Enneagram book, a kind of introductory book. Sometimes I would loan out some of my books. Now, with tests, you have to be a little careful, right? Because sometimes people would say, "Oh, where can I take a test?" And so I would need to tell the person that a lot of the online tests that you just get when you Google Enneagram tests aren't accurate, and that they would need to know that, but they could take it if they wanted to. So now, again, I think time has passed, and there are better options, and the Enneagram doesn't seem so strange as it did maybe 20, 25 years ago. But that's how I would open it up. And for a little while, I had what I called an Enneagram starter kit. And I had an art magazine article that I'd printed out, made copies of. I had sometimes I would give David Daniels' Essential Enneagram book. Although now that I know the subtypes, I don't offer that anymore, because I think it doesn't always help people get to the right type because of the subtype factor. And then I would offer, sometimes I had a list, had a piece of paper with a list of books, an Enneagram bibliography that I would hand out. Now that would be different, what I would hand out today, but that's how I would try to get people started. And then I would see what happened. For some clients, they would get really into it very quickly. It would change everything very fast. And other clients, they would come back and they just weren't talking about it. They didn't bring it up. And so I would really take my cue from my client. Like if it doesn't seem like they're interested, I don't want to push this on them. Now, again, that was before. Now I find that people are very open to it. Sometimes people have already heard of the Enneagram. And so I do think it's a little bit different today for therapists who are starting out today. They can even offer it, on their website as one of the things they do if they specialize in it. But of course, they should get a deep training in the Enneagram and not just know it at a superficial level. That's very, very important. If you're going to use it as a therapeutic tool in an official way with your clients or even promote yourself as using it, you need to know the system at a deep level because you can go in a lot of wrong directions if you don't know it well enough. For instance, you can mistype someone. Um, and I tried to be really careful about typing because sometimes people would come in and they'd tell me their type and I would recognize they might be wrong. But you can't just say, "Oh, I think you're wrong about your type. I think you're actually this type." You need to be careful as a therapist because what you say carries a lot of weight. And you want to be modeling being deeply respectful of the person and their process.
Yeah, yeah, makes a lot of sense, B. Thank you. Do you think you could share with us, let's say, a couple of cases or so using that you use the Enneagram in psychotherapy with clients that if you hadn't used it, the results would have been very different and worse?
That's a great question. Let me think if there. I'll try to use some from the deep past. Um, uh, and so I'm thinking of one case when I was working with a young woman, and pretty soon in the therapy, I could tell that she was a 9. And she was struggling a lot in her life from feeling really stuck, both in terms of her work or career and in terms of a relationship she was in. She was in a relationship with someone and it wasn't going well, but she was having a hard time deciding whether to get out of it and getting out of it. Uh, when she did think about if she would do that, how would that happen? Should she do it? There was a lot of indecision and a lot of difficulty accessing her deeper sense of herself. And there were a lot of times, and again, this was early on when I was in a therapist, probably in my first 5 or 6 years. And she would often ask me with a lot of desperation, a lot of emotion, like, what should I do? Tell me what to do. And if I had not known the Enneagram, I probably would have told her what to do, and that would have been exactly the wrong thing. Because for 9s, they will look outside themselves for the answers, when especially as part of their therapy, they need to learn to access the answers inside themselves, and they need to learn that even though when they at first say, "What do I want?" they don't know, and they may not know for a while, that the whole point of their work is to recognize that they do know inside themselves. There's just something blocking them. That, because of a long experience of not being heard or listened to, being overlooked, they learn to go along to get along, and their focus of attention is so much on the outside. And so I knew, even though I have to say, as a 2, and again, it helped me to know my type, right? Because as a 2, I love, helping people know what they should do for themselves. I often think I know exactly what they should do or what their right answer is or what they should decide. And the pride in me makes me want to tell them. And then, won't it be great when I saved them or when they didn't know what to do and I told them what to do and it all worked out great, right? So that's the pride in me talking. Now, of course, it doesn't always work out, and I don't always know what someone should do, even if I think I do. So it was very good that I knew my own type and knew that I needed to restrain my impulse to tell her what to do, just for because as a two, I can overdo that, thinking I know what's best for other people when I don't. But also, I knew that as a nine, she would know uh, that if I gave her the answer to her problem, I would have failed her. And even if she didn't know that intellectually or cognitively, she would know it at a gut level. If she begged me to tell her what to do, and I told her, I knew she instantly would have lost faith in me as a therapist. Even if she didn't know that she had, she would figure it out very quickly that that was exactly the wrong thing. That the whole reason she was there and the whole reason I was working with her was to help her know herself and help her know what she wanted and help her develop better access to her own desires and her own agenda and her own feelings. And so even though it was hard to see her struggle, and sometimes I mean, she was funny. She had a great sense of humor. So sometimes she would really kind of almost jokingly, kind of in different ways, kind of trick me into telling her what to do. And it was sort of a joke between us. I knew that I had to avoid doing that at all costs, because the whole process she was in was learning to not consult her family or the people around her for what was best for her, but to have a sense of what that was from inside herself. Let's do a short break.
Do you want to dive deeper into the Enneagram? Do you want to take your self-development to the next level? Join B and Udanio in their live retreats and register to be a part of their personal mastery program. You can become a Chestnut Paes black belt by taking all 3 of their intensive Enneagram-based inner work retreats.
Now, I know that you use object relations theory the most as your particular line in as a psychotherapist. But my question is, do you think that there are some lines of therapy that are more compatible with the Enneagram, or also that are more compatible with clients of each Enneagram triad or dominant center of intelligence? What would be your comments about this? And we will have in the future specific podcasts talking, like one podcast for object relations theory and the Enneagram alone. So, without getting too much into details of this, what could you say about this?
This is a great question because, of course, there are different approaches to therapy, and different therapists may specialize in different approaches. They usually do. Usually you're trained in one or maybe 2 or 3 different approaches, and you that's the one that you apply the most. And that's important. And it's also important, if you're someone looking to find a good therapist, to ask what approach they use and to consider whether that's the right one for you. So yes, I consider myself, the way I was trained. I was trained psychoanalytically. Now, all that means is it's the body of psychological literature or the approach that was post-Freudian. It started with Freud, but it's not Freudian. Um, there are there's some psychoanalysts who are still strictly Freudian, but most therapists who work psychoanalytically more follow the body of large group of theorists who came right after Freud, who kind of expanded on the pioneering work he did. But really what it's all about is that we believe that early relationships shape our template of how we relate to other people and how we understand ourselves. It's like we walk around with a cast of characters inside our head, depending on who our parents were and how they treated us. Now, many people who are long time listeners of the podcast may know that you and I believe that we come in with type, that type is something that's with us from from birth. But of course, we're shaped a lot by our early relationships. And even more than that, the object relations theory will say something along the lines of um, that we are relationship seeking beings, that we are oriented by needing love and connection. And so what happens early on in our life around our love relationships, our early connections, is shapes us deeply, especially in terms of how we relate to other people. Now, of course, our type does as well. So that's my approach. And I've done, and I would just want to say one note of caution. Sometimes I see object relations in the Enneagram world boiled down to a simple formula. It's much more than that. So please remember that object relations is a large body of theory. Many different theorists have contributed to it, and it's it's a great body of theory because it really speaks about what we need to learn about ourselves and the way we relate to others in the world so that we can grow. I've written a paper on that you can download from my website, integrating the Enneagram and object relations theory. But so I won't say more about that. But that was my approach. And so my approach, the way I was trained is when people come to therapy, they are going to interact with the therapist in exactly the way they interact with people in their own lives. Now, that makes the therapeutic relationship, the relationship between the client and the therapist, the perfect laboratory for learning new ways of relating. So one of the things as a relational therapist I was very attuned to is, how is the person acting with me? Are they forthcoming? What fantasies or thoughts do they have about how I'm judging them or what I'm thinking about them? All of these things are really, really important. So relational therapy is what I did. Now, I don't always bring up the relationship, but I always have one eye on it. How is this person relating to me, and how can that inform me? What am I feeling as I'm with this person? How can that inform me about what's going on with this person? Now, that is probably a very much of a heart type approach, right? Because it's literally relationship therapy or relational therapy. We're putting the relationship between the person and the other people in their lives front and center. So I would say object relations could be a great approach, or the relational approach, for everyone. However, I think it makes sense that I was drawn to that, and it's also, I think, a approach to therapy that is more heart based. That's a lot about how are you feeling, and how are you feeling about the people in your lives, and how are you feeling about yourself, and so that's what I would say. Now, I love this question because it lets me say this. I believe the Enneagram is, and not everyone maybe will believe me when I say this, and you don't have to, but I believe the Enneagram is like a grand psychological theory, and it's like the big picture of the different ways we can do therapy. And it's almost like each of the different types or triads of types has different kinds of therapeutic approaches associated with it. And there's a great book called Faces in a Cloud, and it's a book about how different psychological theorists through history that are famous, and that are people that have really changed the field. Um, their theories were very much shaped by their type, by their personality, by who they were. For instance, there's a theorist in the object relations um, sort of field, Melanie Klein, and she was immediately post-Freud. And if you read her theory, it's so clear that she was a sexual four. It's so interesting because it's all about envy and it's all about anger. And interestingly, historically, she was very envious of Anna Freud, who was Freud's daughter, who was an ego psychologist, who was also so there was this community of psychologists right after Freud, and they were in this community together. And Melanie Klein wanted to be Freud's daughter, but wasn't, and was in the position of envying the person who actually was and was in the field. But the thing about Melanie Klein's theory is it's infused with envy. I mean, she's the first person who talked all about envy as a really important psychological experience, and how it was there early on in life, not from the very beginning, but from a certain stage of development. So there's that. Now there's, for instance, the Gestalt approach, right? And many people may have heard of Gestalt therapy, which I think is an excellent, wonderful approach to therapy. And it's very body based. It's very based on what is happening in the moment right now. Where are you in your body right now? And there's a whole approach to therapy that is part of the Gestalt approach. Now, Fritz Perls was the person who developed Gestalt, the Gestalt approach, and he probably was an 8. And it's a very 8-ish body-based kind of therapy. It's a little more confrontive. It's a little bit more like getting right to, okay, what's going on right now? You know, don't need to talk about the past, don't need to go too deeply into your, complex feelings about your parents. What are you feeling right now in the moment? And different kinds of ways of accessing that, different kinds of ways of seeing how that plays out when you're sort of having a contact with other people, a whole lexicon of ways of understanding language, of understanding your experience through this other modality, which is a little more 8-ish. Now, Claudio Naranjo, who is one of the pioneers of the Enneagram, especially as the Enneagram came out into the world after Oscar Ichazo. And, he was someone who worked with Fritz Perls and the Gestalt movement. And so I think he often used Gestalt techniques in the early days in working with the Enneagram. And cognitive behavioral theory. Now, I find that's an approach that I always think, isn't it interesting that cognitive behavioral therapy, we sometimes call it CBT, it's a very widely used approach. And I think it's a little bit more of a mental approach. Now, I always say, okay, we know with the Enneagram we have 3 centers, right? What's missing in the title cognitive behavioral? It's always interesting to me that the emotional is missing in that title. It's like we're talking about cognition, we're talking about behavior. Now, cognitive behavioral therapists will tell you that they also talk about emotions, that they talk about all 3 and how they're interrelated and how we have different schemas or beliefs or ideas or uh, thoughts, recurring thoughts, and how those are connected to specific emotions and behaviors. However, in the title, the emotional part got left out. And I think part of that is because it tends to skew a little bit more toward the cognitive. Now, I'm not saying I'm for or against any of these approaches. I could never be a cognitive behavioral therapist because I think the relational approach fits more for me. Emotions are more front and center for me. However, I think it's a great approach. And there are times when I have used it, when I have drawn on it, because I think there are times that it's really important to highlight how there are certain beliefs that are driving people that are very deeply rooted that they have a really hard time getting over. Now, it's going to be hard to change your belief without also dealing with the emotions that are connected to that belief. But it's I think one of the benefits of cognitive behavioral therapy that it looks at those 3 things as kind of going together. But I've noticed that it tends to be used a little bit more by head types and sometimes more in cultures that are less comfortable with really exploring emotions at a deep level.
Yeah, yes. I just want to mention something. You and I at CP Enneagram Academy, we have our own model of levels of awareness, which is based on the Enneagram. And we talk about different kinds of therapies that people need depending on where they are on those levels, regardless even of their Enneagram type. So many times we see the need for changes in the therapeutic approach for someone when growth is happening. And in a way, this is another way to use the Enneagram as a process map to understand how therapy can best help people. Now, I have one last question to you, B, and this was a question that our great therapist and CP coach in Brazil, Renata Paes, suggested I asked you. How do you deal with transference and counter-transference in therapy when using the Enneagram?
Yeah, it's very important to define what we're talking about because not everyone knows these terms. So transference is a term for the idea that we all will transfer the emotions that we normally have toward people, usually starting with our parents, toward the therapist. It sort of says I'm going to have feelings about my therapist, and the transference is whatever feelings I'm having about my therapist. And it's a little bit like how I'm relating to my therapist in terms of the relationship and especially the emotional part. For instance, um, we often say, or I was taught in when I was becoming a therapist, that positive transference was a big benefit if you were working with someone. So in other words, if your client really likes you as a therapist, if they have positive feelings about you, that's a good thing because they'll probably more likely trust you. They'll more likely be engaged in the therapy and the relationship. And that's helpful to them because then you can really help them more because they're more deeply connected to you. They listen to you more. They're more engaged in their own therapy. So it's the transference is how the person feels about the therapist. For instance, um, I had one particular therapist for a long time, and I really liked him, and I felt like he really cared about me. And so, but at the same time, beyond just liking him, um, all the feelings I tend to have about the people in my life, about my parents, about men, about people I want to like me are going to show up in that relationship. So I noticed at one point that I also was kind of afraid of what he thought about me. Right. So I'm going in and I bring in all my feelings that I have about people generally, but about especially, people that I need to work on in therapy. So I need to learn to be more open with people and especially with someone I like. So transference is simply the feeling that you have about your therapist. Now, sometimes these can be romantic feelings, right? So we often hear that if someone sort of falls in love with their therapist, that can be something that tends to be unspoken. But it may lead to things getting acted out in that therapy. Now, from a therapeutic point of view, we always view transference as something good because it can be worked with. If it shows up in the relationship with the therapist, it's an opportunity for learning, especially to the point where you can talk about it. Now, sometimes the client might be too embarrassed to talk about how they feel, but sometimes they may talk about how they feel. And we would say there's a high degree of change that is possible when you can really work with the transference. But also, it's something therapists really need to be mindful of and very attuned to. Because they need to understand all the feelings that person is bringing to us, and all the things like relationship issues they may need to work out from the past that are connected to the feelings that they're having about us as therapists. So that's the transference. The transference is the idea that we will transfer to other people the feelings we developed early on is kind of a template, kind of a way of feeling about people, the different possibilities we had uh, from early on in childhood. Now, transference doesn't just happen with therapists, it happens with everyone, right? So maybe I go meet a new friend and there's transference I may with her because I may transfer some feelings or some relational templates I have about relating to women to a new friend, right? But in therapy, it has a specific term, and we talk about the transference a lot because we need to be very aware of how the person feels about us so that we can play the role we need to play in helping the person be more aware of their feelings and their relationship patterns. Now, countertransference is simply the way the therapist feels about the client. So it's like countertransference. It's like going the other direction. So my countertransference as a therapist will be how I feel about my client. And sometimes you'll hear therapists talking about how there's a client they have that's hard to work with. And so they may have some more complicated countertransference, like there's things they don't like about them or they get angry. Uh, but there can also be countertransference that's about a lot of love or feeling a lot of positive feelings, a lot of positive regard, a lot of appreciation for the other person. But again, just like with the Enneagram, the name of the game is always awareness. It's always consciousness. It's not that anything's right or wrong or good or bad. It's that it just is. We are going to have feelings about the people we interact with in our life. And the more important someone is, the more different kinds of complex feelings are likely to arise. And it's just very important for the therapist, particularly, to be aware of that, to be on top of, oh, wow, this person said this to me. That might indicate they're having a certain feeling about me. How do I want to work with that? Do I want to not say anything? Do I want to say something? Do I want to draw their attention to it? Is it better for them if I don't draw their attention to it? I just notice it and see how things evolve. So the therapist is always, if they're a good therapist, having an inner dialogue with themselves about how to meet their client in the best possible way to help their growth, knowing that in that therapeutic relationship, it's like a very fertile field for being able to address a person's relationship issues, because they're going to come up just like they have with other people in their lives. So adding the Enneagram into that, I will say that, again, just like with so many things, I think the Enneagram just adds more insight, more information about what's likely going on. So if I'm noticing that someone's not really very engaged with me, they're a little more businesslike in their therapy. They're not really, let's say they're not showing their tears, or they're wanting more practical results. They're focusing on, I might think, oh, wow, maybe this person is a 1 or a 3. Because it might take them a longer time to get more emotionally engaged, or maybe it's hard for them to open up to their own emotions. And so it's hard for them to feel or express emotions toward me. Because I know the Enneagram and I have those possibilities in mind of different types, it can help me understand what I'm experiencing in the transference and my own countertransference. There have been times when I've needed to work with clients, for instance, who are very angry. Now, I'm a 2, I'm as a 2 with my own history, I tend to be more conflict avoidant. I get very uncomfortable if someone's angry at me. So in the beginning, in the early years of being a therapist, when a client would get angry with me, it was very difficult for me, right? So they're having transference toward me, right? They're getting angry at me. And as a therapist, I knew enough to know they need to get angry at me, right? They need to learn something about their anger and about what happens when they get angry at someone. And sometimes what happens to people who are angry, and again, there are several types on the Enneagram, that like 8s, 4s, especially sexual 4s, some 1s, some 6s. I mean, there are different types that get angry and may need to have a positive, healthy experience of being able to express their anger and have it received in a good way, so that they can get better at managing their anger and get better at the way that they express it to people, right? Because often early on when you're in therapy, it's coming out in kind of a raw form, right? So someone's getting really angry at me. And this happened a few times at one point in my therapeutic practice. And I noticed in myself, and this is my countertransference, I noticed that that was deeply distressing to me, and I watched what I was doing, And I noticed I was doing all the things I do when someone gets mad at me. And I was even picturing my mother being mad at me. And I would just try to make it better, or I would want to run away and hide, or I would just try to take back whatever I said. I just want to get it over with as soon as possible. Do or say whatever I had to do or say to make it so the person wasn't angry at me anymore. Well, guess what? That's not good for the client, because the client needs to express that anger and they need me to receive it. They need me to help them understand it. They need me to help them understand how people experience their anger, because some of these people are people who were having trouble establishing relationships because the people in relationships just wanted to get away from them, right? If someone's getting really angry at you and all you want to do, some people will just say, I can't handle your anger. See you later, right? And so this is a person who's maybe going to have problems in relationships unless they can learn to understand where their anger comes from, manage it. But they can only do that if you can meet them there as the therapist. And so I actually went and found a consultant. I went to a course about learning to deal with people who are expressing aggression in the therapy. And then I went into consultation with the guy who taught that course. And then I got into a group with the guy who taught that course. And so over time, I studied, my own reactions and how to get better. And so I learned what I needed to do better with my own countertrain, my own feelings about the person's feelings, and the fact that they needed to be able to express anger and have it heard, received, worked with, and for us to be able to relate in that, so that the person could learn how to grow in terms of how they express anger. So I'm glad we've talked about this. I think it's an important topic, and I appreciate your good questions, Uranio. And I know that we'll have more podcasts where we go more deeply into different aspects of some of the things we touched on today. So now it's time for our top 5.
What is our top 5 today, B?
Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to do 2 top 3s. One top 3 of the types that tend to go to therapy the most, and one top 3 of the types that tend to go to therapy the least.
Right, so it's our top 3, double top 3 today instead of our top 5. Okay,
Exactly.
I like that. It's creative.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's start with the 3 that go the most, shall we?
Yes.
What is your third one? The third type that goes the most to therapy, and let's say spontaneously, right?
Yes. So I cheated a little bit here. I have a tie at my third position. I put 9 and 6.
Okay.
Because I think 9s often go to therapy because they experience some sort of problems in life with the fact that they're not as connected to themselves as they might be, whether it's getting stuck in a job they don't like, or not knowing what to do for a career, or having relationship issues because they're not connected to themselves as they need to be. And I think 6s, because sometimes they have anxiety issues or issues that stem from their fearfulness, whether it's problems in relationship or ways that their fear holds them back in life.
Interesting. Well, my third is type 1. And this is because I decided differently than you, B. I decided not to cheat because I was inclined to say 1 and 9, but I didn't cheat. And and my third then is type 1. I think that ones go to therapy spontaneously a bit more than average because they see a lot of problems in themselves. It's easy for them to be self-critical, and sometimes they really think there is something wrong with them, even when there isn't, even when it's just their personalities, and nothing worse than for any of us. So, what is your second?
So my second is 2. I think 2s go to therapy quite a lot, because they often focus a lot of attention on relationships, and relationships are so central in our lives. And when they have relationship difficulties or emotional difficulties related to uh, relationships, they often really need relief. And so I think they turn to therapy as a way of exploring what's going on in relationships.
Interesting. Yeah. I did not include choose on either of the two lists that I did because while I see your point and I do see choose going to therapy for that, I think that many times choose think that other people need it more than them, you know. But I really see your point. But my second is 6, for reasons that you talked about. I think also 6s tend to be self-critical, and then there is the anxiety piece and insecurity, and I think they're also more humble in a way to admit that they need it. So I am thinking that our first will be the same. What is yours?
4. My first
Yeah,
is 4. Yeah.
bingo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why is that big?
Well, I think 4s live more in their emotions. I think they have less of the fears related to the therapeutic process that other people have. Other types of people may be afraid of sharing at a deep level about themselves, may have fears of getting emotional or sharing their emotions or crying in front of someone else, whereas 4s, I think, value authenticity, they value deep connection, they live in their own internal world in a really big way. And so I think sharing that with a therapist doesn't seem like a big stretch. In fact, it seems like something important.
Yeah, for the same reasons, I also have 4 as my number one. And I see some tendencies for 4s. I think that they tend to be more picky when it comes to selecting the therapist. And sometimes, it's even there is the push pull mechanism with the therapist, but they really like, I think, the experience of doing therapy because they're really comfortable exploring their own emotions and sharing them most of the cases, not all. Now let's talk about the 3 types that don't go as much to therapy spontaneously. What is your third?
So I cheated again, and I know you pointed out already that you're more virtuous than
It's
I am
okay.
because you
It's
didn't cheat.
okay.
So I
Yeah.
actually made this a top 4, I think. It was
Hmm.
hard to squeeze it into 3 in retrospect. So my number 3, I have actually 1 and 3.
Hmm.
And ones I could be biased from my own practice, my own experience in therapy. I didn't see a lot of ones coming to therapy. And when they did, I often had the sense that they didn't want to stay very long. Like they wanted to come to sort of solve a very specific issue and they wanted a very practical solution, and then they were hoping to leave. Um, so that's just was partly my experience. So that could be colored. I could not be seeing the whole universe of ones in therapy, but some of the ones I know as well just sort of looked at themselves as, there's good behavior and bad behavior, and they just needed to learn to get better. And it wasn't really a matter of exploring the depths. So
Yes.
that was my thinking. And then 3s, because I think in some ways it's not completely the 3s' fault. It's our culture, especially Western culture, especially US culture, which is, of course, where I practiced. 3s, there's often a sense that nothing's wrong, because either they're successful and they're focusing on work and they tend to be very good at controlling things around work. Um, but I didn't, so I didn't see them coming to therapy very often. And again, it was similar. If they did come, they'd want a kind of a quick fix. It might be hard to have more patience with themselves, with the therapeutic process. But when they did come, I found it was usually for anxiety, something related to anxiety that they were feeling that was rising to the level where it was creating some sort of problem that they needed to address.
Yeah, interesting. My third is also type 3. And not only what you've already said, but I've seen threes, waiting until there is a breakdown or something more serious to go to therapy. And I think there is the thing about time, the time that they will need to dedicate to therapy, and usually they think they don't have that time. And the basic mechanism for threes in ordinary life is, let me push my emotions away, although they are big, so that I perform. So going to therapy is a little counter-instinctive when this happens. But I have seen threes also going to therapy, several threes, when they get feedback from someone they respect, admire, that they should do that. Or in cultures where going to therapy is really valued, which is interesting. Like, I'm Brazilian, and our neighboring country there, Argentina, is perhaps the country in the world where more people do therapy in general, and that is really valued. And threes go to therapy more in there, in my experience. So yeah, this is my third. But what is your second?
My second is 5. I think 5s find it a bit harder to open up and go to therapy and share a lot of things about themselves. There can be some discomfort, a sense of either not needing it because they're not so connected to their emotions, or a sense of discomfort around the process.
Yeah, I get your point. I did not include fives also on either of the two lists, but if I had a draw on my third, it would be 7 and 5. But so five didn't make it to my
You
list,
mean you
and
mean 3 and 5?
yeah, 3 and 5. Sorry, yeah.
Mhm.
And but my number two is 7.
Mm.
I don't think that sevens go too often to therapy because they avoid pain and they rationalize, the need for therapy. And then when they go to therapy, they try to fool the therapist. But I don't see many sevens going spontaneously to therapy. And so it's my number two. What is your first? I think it's the same as mine also.
Yeah, we did the same in the number 1 slot, and then a lot of
Yeah.
interesting differences in the others.
Yes.
My number 1 is type 8.
Yeah, bingo again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't see many 8s spontaneously going to therapy, uh, mostly because it can be a vulnerable thing to need help, to get in touch with your feelings, to open up to somebody else, to ask for help in that way. They just tend to avoid vulnerability, and they tend to overpower the challenge or feel like they have everything they need already to meet whatever challenges in life. And they can poo-poo, they can look down a bit sometimes, some 8s, on the process of therapy, and I think as a defensive way of not looking at their own, what they might see as weaknesses, and not going into their own vulnerability. It's interesting. The only times I saw 8s in my therapy practice were in couples. So usually I would find there was the partner was bringing their 8 partner into therapy because they weren't communicating well or they were having problems.
Yeah, interesting. I agree, and I also think that there is the tendency for a denial of the need for therapy, or emotional pain in itself. And many eights come up with a concept for themselves that people who go to therapy are weaker, which is not true. But sometimes this is an obstacle for them to go to therapy, and sometimes they judge people by thinking so. And it's hard because at times eights don't really feel the problem that is, and there is this practical approach to life, saying, whatever has happened, here I am, I'm okay, and I just go forward, straight forward in life. On the other hand, I just want to say that when eights start doing inner work, and like many of our students, that is not the case anymore, and they really get more committed to doing things like therapy.
So I think that ends our somewhat unconventional top 5 for today. We want to thank you for listening. Join us again for our next 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.